Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1988 horror sequel, Hellbound, Hellraiser II. Now, once again, I have the Scarlet Box Blu-ray release. I really like the cover art here with Chatterer. It's a very disturbing, striking visual. And that's fitting for Hellbound Hellraiser 2 because Hellbound is a film that is chock full of disturbing and striking visuals. And those visuals are definitely some of the film's biggest highlights. Now, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is one of those films where when I first saw it, I was definitely more of a fan. And over the years, I've had more issues with it. And after I watched it the most recent time around, those issues still exist and are pretty persistent and definitely do prevent the film, in my opinion, from living up to its full potential. At the end of the day, I still like Hellraiser 2. I think it's a decent sequel. It's enjoyable enough, despite how bleak and dark and messed up it is, but that's Hellraiser for you. But there are certain aspects of the film that do not work at all for me, and those aspects are what really brings it down considerably. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with my views and my opinion of this film, and that's perfectly fine. We should not tear each other apart because we have different opinions. Those are what makes this world interesting, and we should continue to share those different opinions with one another or on YouTube or on other platforms, so everyone isn't just always thinking on the same wavelength. That being said, yeah, I do have some issues with Hellraiser 2. The direction, though, isn't really one of them. The direction by Tony Randel, it's fine. See, the direction by Tony Randel is not at any point bad enough for it to be something that I am going to criticize that strongly or that much. But it's also not something that's great enough or consistently good enough to really provide a ton of praise. The direction is there. It's serviceable. It's decent enough. Tony Randel definitely knows how to deftly handle a camera. There are some moments in the film where he uses movement and angles to create a very surreal and nightmarish look to the film. But there are a lot of moments in the movie that just kind of play out like a static effects showcase. And I think that's a problem that the first film also had. And that's a problem that the sequel also has because of the fact that Tony Randel, he only really directed one film prior to this, DEFCON 4, and his direction in that wasn't what I would call impressive. So you have a director who is barely starting out, and a guy who I think he was involved with the first film in some capacity, is either like a co-writer or a producer or one of those things. And he's now tasked with this absolutely Herculean task of handling this sequel, which is much anticipated. And on top of that, he's also saddled with the pressure of trying to save a studio that is collapsing. And what I mean by that is the production company that released Hellraiser and also released this film, New World Pictures, was in a serious financial bind at this point. They were bleeding money, they were bleeding out fast, and Tony Randel was essentially given the impossible task of directing this film and doing a good enough job to make it so the film made enough money to keep them alive. And that didn't happen. New World went under pretty soon after this film was released. They were intended to be the company that was going to release Warlock, for instance, but that didn't wind up getting released by them because they went under. Dolph Lundgren's The Punisher was the first and only film their international distribution company produced because they experienced such financial losses that made it so they could no longer remain in business. This rushed nature when it comes to this film is also a big reason why this movie isn't as good as it honestly could have been, because of the fact that New World was strictly firmly behind the eight ball and wanted this film out as soon as possible. It's the same kind of problem that plagued RoboCop 2 and definitely RoboCop 3, because Orion was in such a similar straits financially. And it's one of those things where it's just unfortunate. I think Hellraiser 2 could have been a much better film if it had more time to have a little more polish, had more time to bring in a few more writers, and maybe potentially a different director. They didn't have the time to get a director who was established and really was a veteran of the horror genre, because they either couldn't afford a director like that, or they just didn't have a lot of time to do a search. They just found Tony Randel, knew that he directed previously for the company, and were like, all right, Tony, here's the job. I don't even know if they had anyone else in mind to direct this sequel. And for what he was tasked with, he did a fine enough job. He really did. But there are some moments where the lack of money, the lack of budget, the lack of cohesion from the script and the vision that a lot of the people who were behind the story and the script had for the film definitely did come to the forefront. And those moments really did affect Tony Randel's overall direction. But yeah, considering the circumstances, I do have to give him credit, because you also have to keep in mind, folks, this film lost like 30% of its budget over halfway through shooting. So there might have been a completely different vision in mind. Tony Randel might have had scenes that he wanted to shoot in particular ways that were taken away from him. And that also wound up hurting the direction and the overall film. And that's not really something that's entirely his fault. And I know that Clive Barker wanted to be involved, and I think they initially wanted to get Clive involved more. But the problem was, I guess, because of some contract that Clive signed or something that was going on with the rights and whatever, like Clive couldn't actually direct the film or be that involved with the movie, which I find to be pretty nuts. But I guess just one of those things where they just couldn't really get Clive involved that much, or Clive might have had other things that he was doing and didn't have as much time. He wrote a little bit of a story, but nothing really that concrete. So Peter Atkins had to come in and write the script. And there are definitely worse sequels out there than Hellraiser 2. There's definitely worse scripts out there than Hellraiser 2. But for me, this is definitely one of the most disappointing sequel scripts when it comes to a horror film. Because things are set up in a way where you have a really good concept. You have an expanded glimpse into the backstory of the Cenobites, as well as their version of hell, this labyrinth of unending mazes and tortures and personal hells. And you have Kirsty, who's in an insane asylum, and she's there because she's haunted and understandably distraught after what she witnessed in the first film. and she befriends this other younger girl who is mute and is being taken advantage of by the head of this asylum, Dr. Philip Chanard. So she forms this connection with Tiffany, and that's rather sweet. It gives Ashley Lawrence's character, Kirsty Cotton, more to do as a character. It provides her a nice little arc as well. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like Ripley and Newt, but this time around, it's Kirsty's version of that. And Julia returns just like Frank did from Beyond the Grave, and you have skinless Julia instead of skinless Frank, and that kind of ties into one of the other problems I have with this sequel. Yes, the way that the screenwriter handles skinless Julia is different than skinless Frank, but the differences aren't that dramatic enough for me that it doesn't feel like they're just rehashing the same thing. She gets brought back from under the floorboards. Well, it's not really under the floorboards. She gets brought back from a mattress, and instead of Julia feeding people to Frank, now there's this doctor who's feeding people to Julia. And when the film was going and focusing on that when it comes to the story, it just wasn't as effective to me as when it was focusing on Kirsty and Tiffany and so on. Also, I know that the first film didn't really have a lot of the Cenobites in it, and it was effective as a result. But in the sequel, this was way, way too little when it comes to the Cenobites. You have the little bit in the beginning that provides some backstory for Pinhead and a little short origin, which I thought was interesting. And in all honesty, I think that's all that the script needed to give you like a little taste of the backstory of the Cenobites, specifically the lead Cenobite, Pinhead. But instead, this script takes a completely different route and explains the backstory and origins of all of the Cenobites. And I don't really think that was a good idea. It completely takes away the mystique of these characters, and it makes them less unique and interesting. Then, if that isn't bad enough, you have that little glimpse of Pinhead and his origin early in the film. And then Pinhead and the Cenobites don't really show up until I think like 50 minutes or like an hour into the movie. And that's just unacceptable. And when they do show up, they do nothing. See, that's the thing that really upsets me about this sequel, other than how Dr. Chanard is handled as a Cenobite, which I'll get to that soon enough, trust me. But how they handle the Cenobites and their short appearances throughout this film. In Hellraiser, they weren't on the screen a lot, but for the most part, the screenwriters made the most out of those cameo roles and really made them stand out in a good way. In Hellraiser 2, it's the opposite. They show up, and all that happens is they get overpowered by a new Cenobite, and they get completely destroyed and annihilated by this guy, and that's it. That's all that happens with with Pinhead and the Cenobites. They don't put up much of a fight at all against the new Cenobite. They don't really get involved in a lot when it comes to anything particular, when it comes to like kills or any of these other sort of things. They show up, say a few lines, and then get wiped out in 5 seconds. I mean, if this was any other horror sequel, like for example, if this was like a Halloween film, for instance, from what I've been hearing about the Halloween Ends, they did a kind of similar thing where Michael Myers is barely in the movie, and when he does show up, he doesn't do much of anything and then gets killed off. Where this is even worse than that, because the Pinhead and the Cenobites show up at the end of the film and then just get completely wrecked by the Chanard Cenobite. And that's it. So you have the sequel that has marketing that features these Cenobites all over it, and they're barely in the fucking film, and when they do show up, they get completely, absolutely wrecked. That then ties into my other glaring, just really big flaw that I have with this screenplay. The way that it handles Chanard and his Cenobite. I know there are people who like this portrayal. I know there's people who think that this version of Chanard is scary. I thought it was unbelievably ridiculous and laughable. The man sounded like a cheap Halloween decoration. Going, it was just absolutely ridiculous. I couldn't take it seriously. He was spouting doctor puns like he was Dr. Giggles' granddad. And to make matters worse, he shows up, gets involved in a battle with the Cenobites, with Pinhead and his crew, and he wins way too fucking easily. I understand the logic behind it. Kirsty showed a photo of a Pinhead when he was human that weakened them, and Chanard took advantage of that. But the way that things were executed sucked. I can't sit here and lie and say otherwise. I felt the execution of that was absolutely terrible by the screenwriter. I thought Peter Atkins executed that miserably. And I was okay with the Cenobites being weakened a little bit. I was okay with Pinhead and the Cenobites maybe dying in this film, because they intended for this to be it. They intended it for this film to be the final movie and the final film in this franchise, and just to end this Hellraiser story right here. And if that's the case, then let these Cenobites, if you're going to show their humanity, give them redemption. Actually show them put up more of a fight before they die. Or maybe have Pinhead be the one that ultimately takes out Chanard and sacrifices his life to save Kirsty and Tiffany. Instead of the way that it's handled in the script, which is clunky and not nearly as effective. I just don't understand the thought process when it comes to Atkins and whoever else was behind this decision when it comes to how they handled the Cenobites in this film. I also don't understand why they decided to completely shift the entire tone when Chanard shows up and have him giggling and making doctor puns, when the film prior to that point was incredibly dark, incredibly disturbing, and unnerving. That whole sequence when Julia is resurrected and takes out the homeless guy. I mean, prior to that, the homeless guy is just cutting himself up with a razor, hallucinating that he's covered in bugs, and it's an incredibly visceral and grueling scene to watch. And then you have Dr. Chanard, the doctor is in. Yeah, it's just like, what the fuck is this? Like, what? The tone is so jarring now that it gives you whiplash. And it didn't do Julia justice either, because Julia, for some reason, the force that is behind all of this stuff, that's creating the Cenobites, the Leviathan, it's chosen Chanard to be its vessel so it can go around this hell and collect all these souls without any boundaries. And the Cenobites are in the way, so that's why it uses Chanard to take them out. But even if that is the case, I don't understand why this thing doesn't Cenobitize Julia. Why did this thing just bring her back so then it can bring them Chanard? It just felt like the rules that they're establishing here for this Leviathan, this entity, were kind of iffy. And then on top of that, Chanard, because he's connected to the Leviathan, is instantly overpowered. And to make matters worse, when he gets involved in that confrontation with Kirsty, the only reason why Chanard is defeated is because of circumstance, because of just pure chance. One of his finger knives gets stuck in the ground, and because of that fact, it gives Kirsty enough time to do something that makes the Leviathan itself rip his head off. It's not really anything that Kirsty did on her own, or even necessarily Tiffany. Like, if he didn't get his finger knives conveniently stuck in the ground, then none of that would have ever happened. And I know that doesn't necessarily tie into Julia, because I'm a little scattershot here. I apologize. But going back to my issues with the way that it handles Julia is she corners Tiffany and Kirsty in a alley of sorts. That might as well be what it is, or a corridor. And the wind just blows her away. That's basically what happens. Her skin gets blown off and she gets blown into an abyss, and that's it. All this buildup, all this effort from the writers to make this character into a queen of hell, so to speak, only for her to get dispatched way too easily. That was a bad trend with this script. Julia gets dispatched way too easily, and so do the Cenobites. And in some ways, so does Chanard, because it's only because his finger knives got stuck in the ground that he was able to get dispatched the way that he was. That's why it would have been better if you had like a more of a fight with the Cenobites and Chanard, and maybe Pinhead is the one that takes him out with the help of Kirsty and Tiffany, instead of it just being one of those things where, well, his finger knives got stuck, and that sucks to be him. It's just it really kind of felt like lazy screenwriting, like Peter Atkins ran out of time and just threw something in there. And honestly, the ending of the film really does feel like that. There's a lot of moments that just feel incredibly rushed, like the screenwriter had no time and just had to put something on the page so they could start shooting. Or it was something that was written on the set of the film because they had to completely change their direction because they lost funding. And if that's the case, that's understandable that there's some issues in terms of the screenplay. But another issue I have, and this is pretty strong, and definitely up there when it comes to my list of issues that I have with this script, is that the mindset itself was problematic. Clive Barker and Peter Atkins and other producers of this film, they intended for the Cenobites to be completely wasted and taken out of the film because they wanted to refocus things on Julia. They wanted to make Julia, Clare Higgins' character, the franchise's star going forward. If there was going to be more Hellraiser films, they wanted Julia to be the focus of everything. And that, in my opinion, is why it was so easy for them to devalue and demystify Pinhead and the Cenobites, because they really didn't want Pinhead and the Cenobites to be the franchise. They wanted Julia to be the face of this franchise going forward, which is an unbelievably stupid thing. As good as Clare Higgins is in this role, she was not good enough to, or a character that was beloved enough by the masses to carry this franchise going forward. I mean, they really did think that this Julia thing was going to work, because they shot an ending where Julia comes back from the dead, from the labyrinth, and bursts out of the mattress again, dressed in a black dress, and she's now the queen of hell. That was the original ending for this movie. The bit with the pillar that comes out of the mattress with Pinhead's face on it, that was all last minute. Because, understandably so, they realized that Julia was not going to cut it as the face of this franchise. It's like Clive Barker and these other people involved with this movie and this franchise at this point in time, they were blind to the fact that Pinhead and these Cenobites were rapidly gaining popularity with audiences and were the biggest draw when it comes to these Hellraiser films. It's not Chanard, it's not Julia, it's not either of those two characters. It's Pinhead and the Cenobites. And this also did lead to some overcompensation, sadly, later on in the franchise, because of the fact that Pinhead and the Cenobites were done so dirty by this movie that the writers for these other films in the franchise felt like they had to overcompensate for what happened here. But yeah, it's just one of those scripts where it starts off strong enough. It's got a good concept. I'm not super big on Dr. Chanard, because I don't really care for the character that much. But prior to him becoming a Cenobite, he was still more tolerable to me. He was definitely more intimidating in my eyes when he was just a crazy maniac doctor who was allowed to get away with a lot of depraved experiments on people. And the idea of him collecting all these lamentation configuration boxes and using this mute autistic girl to open up a portal, I didn't mind that. I didn't mind Kirsty being there, and Kirsty teaming up with Tiffany to take out Chanard and Julia. I didn't mind that either. The whole bit with Frank tricking Kirsty, even though it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it, because why the hell would he be able to project himself the way that he does all the way from hell? But it was still something that drove the plot forward a little bit. That Kirsty is going through all of this. She's willing to go through this hell again because she believes that her father needs her help. But once they get to Chanard and the moment when he becomes a Cenobite, the film just falls apart at the seams for me. It really does. It falls apart at the seams, and it's just not nearly as good or as strong as the other first half of the film's story. So yeah, the biggest issue I have with this film, it all ties down to the script. That's the biggest problem I have with this movie. The reason why this film doesn't live up to its full potential, the reason why it's not, in my opinion, a great film or a great sequel, is because of the way that I feel about the script. Because it's not the cast. I mean, Ashley Laurence does a good job here as Kirsty. I actually think her performance in this is a step up from her performance in the first film. Clare Higgins, for instance, she was amazing. She was so much fun to watch as Julia in this, and I loved her in this one. Like in the first film, I liked her performance, but in this film, I loved it. I loved her scenery chewing villainous performance in this as Julia. But I think that only would have worked in this film. I don't think it would have worked going forward, because Julia being Julia isn't really as compelling as Pinhead and his Cenobites. being the ones that do the damage. Kenneth Cranham as Dr. Philip Chanard. I didn't care for this performance. It was just there for me. Like, it wasn't. It's one of those things where I didn't mind it when he was just Dr. Chanard, but when he was a Cenobite, I hated it. I hated his take on the Chanard Cenobite. I'm not gonna lie. I absolutely loathed it. It was irritating and laughable and just bad. Imogen Boorman as Tiffany. She was decent enough for what she was asked to do. She played a character that didn't really have any dialogue, but she was still integral enough to the plot, and she still managed to have some chemistry with Ashley, despite the fact that the two of them didn't really have any dialogue with one another. Doug Bradley, once again, does a really good job as a stoic, menacing presence that is Pinhead. It's fine too in the little prequel bit where as Captain Elliot Spencer, Nicholas Vince, Simon Bamford, Barbie Wilde as Chatterer Butterball, and the female Cenobite. All three of them were fine too, and their little bit of screen time. Oliver Smith was once again great as Skinless Frank, and he was also pretty good as Mr. Browning. Deborah Droll, I want to give her a lot of credit as Skinless Julia. She was every bit as good and every bit as impressive to me as Oliver Smith was as Skinless Frank in the first film. And of course, the effects. I mean, the effects work in this film are absolutely stupendous. I mean, there's some amazing practical effects in this movie. The Skinless Julia makeup, the look of the labyrinth. There's some nice visual effects despite the low budget. It's a film that definitely does impress when it comes to that level. There are some things, though, where the effects work does kind of look a little chintzy. That's when they're trying to do a lot of visual effects, a lot of lasers, a lot of green screen or blue screen work, and that's where it starts to really show its lower budget. And I think that's also the point in time when they ran out of money. And it's kind of hard for me to really criticize the visual effects that harshly when they didn't have the amount of money that they had to start the production to do these effects sequences. So the fact that they look as good as they do is actually pretty impressive considering the fact that they lost so much money during production. I think that's another reason why certain scenes were not shot or weren't finished. For instance, there's a sequence in the film that was supposed to feature the engineer monster, but that was cut, probably due to budget constraints. There was that surgeon sequence, which was featured in articles about the film, was featured on the back of the VHS, and it was in the trailer, at least part of it was, I think, and it was never in the finished film. That's another sequence that was sadly probably cut due to budget constraints or due to timing, due to pacing. I think that's a sequence where if they had the money, they didn't lose 30% of the production budget, honestly, pretty much last minute, then I think they would have been able to tweak that and do things in a way with that sequence where it actually would have worked well. The deleted footage that we are able to see from that scene, it's not finished. It doesn't have post-production. It doesn't have the editing. It doesn't have the music. So it doesn't seem like a sequence that has a lot of tension or suspense. But I feel like if they had more money to work with, they had more time, they would have been able to add those elements to that scene. And I think that scene being in the film and being touched up, I think that would have helped the movie too. It definitely would have given the Cenobites something to do other than just show up, say a few lines, and die, which would have made what happened with them in their fight with Chanard a little less upsetting, because then you still would have gotten the Cenobites doing something and tormenting Kirsty in a sequence prior to that happening. And of course, I can't talk about Hellraiser without mentioning other technical elements like the cinematography by Robin Vigean and the editing, which Tony Randel did along with Richard Martin, and of course the score. That's the main reason why I said that in particular. That can't talk about Hellraiser without talking about the score, because the score is just so integral to the success of any of these Hellraiser films up until this point. It just creates so much atmosphere and mood on its own, and it really does elevate the sequences that it's featured in. So, yeah, it's one of those films where I like it mainly for the effects, for the visuals, for some of the concepts, a couple of the performances, but I'm not a huge fan of it because of the way the script handled certain things and because of Chanard. I hate that character. I hate it. I hate that character. Seemed like a reject from Beetlejuice. I don't know what the fuck they were thinking with that character, and especially when it comes to how they made him overpowered and just completely wiped the floor with Pinhead and the Cenobites. That wasn't earned, and it just felt like a massive middle finger from the writers, and it didn't sit well with me. But anyway, that's my opinion. That's my thoughts on Hellraiser 2. And until next time, as always, I'll see you later. See ya.